Okay, let's make a start. Welcome to this Liberal Democrat History Group meeting to launch Vince Cable's new book, Partnership and Politics in the Divided Decade. This was, of course, one of the meetings we were hoping to organize at a conference. So we're very happy to be able to rearrange it for this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. In a moment, I'll hand over to our chair and interviewer, Anne Perkins, who will talk to Vince and Rachel about the book and about particular aspects of it for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open this up to questions from yourselves. For those joining us via Zoom, if you can post any questions you might have in the chat, then I will read them out when we get to the appropriate stage. We won't ask you to unmute yourself and ask the questions. Those of you wishing to buy a copy of the book, it's available here for a special bargain price of £10 just for this meeting. And you can get it afterwards, and you can also subscribe to the Journal of Liberal History here, but I'll say a bit more about that a bit later. Okay, thanks very much. Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. So I'm Anne Perkins, and I've spent, can everyone hear me? Is my mic working? I spent my career writing about politics in one form or another. So it really is a great pleasure to have the chance to talk to Vincent and Rachel about their splendid new book, Partnership and Politics. Buy it here, get it signed. As an observer, Vince was always one of the grown-ups in the room. He's the sort of person who would always be, I think, on the list of anyone composing a fantasy government of all the talents. You'd want Vince in the mix somewhere. And I think that makes his take on the extraordinary past 10 years in politics particularly interesting and indeed a key text. But I think what makes this book even more special is the fact that it's got Rachel's insights and commentary as well. And I think that adds a whole new layer to it, because if Vince is the warp, then Rachel's the woof, and together they make this tapestry. Rachel's not just the party activist and the personal support. She's not just wife. She is a smallholder who has, until fairly recently, been running a herd of cattle. And I know how much hard work, heavy lifting, and bureaucratic stuff that entails. So hats off, and it's great to have the combination of your views. I wanted to begin, in fact, on a very personal note, because what you both discuss in the book is something that the rest of us didn't know about, which is that in 2018, Vince experienced a TIA, a minor stroke, and the consequences of it lasted for a week or two afterwards. And a month or two. So I mean, two questions arise. First of all, I wonder why you decided, Vince, Rachel, not to tell anyone outside your immediate.
Well, the issue you raise is one of the few things in the book that people didn't know anything about. I mean, for the most part, we are commenting on things that happened and that were in the public domain, but this was something I thought I should talk about, at least in the book. I kept it secret at the time. I think partly because, we didn't know how bad this was. I mean, I don't know whether anybody in the room has had one of these so-called mini strokes. You're not completely paralyzed, but it has quite serious implications for your balance, your memory, your speech, at least temporarily. So we didn't know how serious it was or how long it was going to last. And partly because, for personal reasons in my family, there was a history of keeping these things secret. I think it may be our generation, but certainly my mother had a history of serious mental illness, and the important thing in our house was never to talk about it, never let anybody know about it. And my late wife died of cancer, and she was very, very insistent that she did not want people to know about it, because, as she put it, people then regard you as a goner. They say nice things, but they write you off. You've moved on. So it was part of my, instinct instinct not to talk about it. As a result, there were some sort of slightly embarrassing or rather embarrassing things happened. I mean, I recall in the book that I was speaking in the House of Commons on one occasion and completely forgot where I was. I didn't know where I was. It felt like about 10 minutes, but it was probably 10 or 20 seconds, I don't know. And eventually I got my bearings again. But fortunately, when I looked around the chamber, all the people there, and there weren't many, were either asleep or working on their iPhones, so it didn't cause a great scandal at the time. The other was a bit more public, that some of you may even remember that I didn't turn up at what some people thought was an important vote in the House of Commons. It wasn't actually important, but it had been built up as an important vote on Brexit. Actually, it was a very technical thing. But the leader of the party, and Tim Farron also, didn't turn up, and this became a big national scandal. And the anti-Brexit movement wanted to know where I was. Why had I been hiding and not doing my job? And it turned out I'd spent most of the day at the hospital doing checks. I had no idea what was going on in Parliament. I probably should have made more of an effort to find out, and then went out to dinner with a journalist who was working on all this cross-party stuff that was bubbling up at the time. Fortunately, Alistair Carmichael was a brick, and he covered up for me and took the blame. But the party federal executive wanted an inquest into why the leader had fallen down on his job. So there were things of that happening, but gradually it sort of improved. But the end point was Rachel and my family, and I think my family more said, look, this can't go on, you're going to kill yourself shortly. And that was certainly a factor, there were others, in deciding to stand down and eventually stand down for Parliament. But there is, I suppose, the policy issue, if you like, is, when these things happen, do you talk about them? I think one of my colleagues, Norman Lamb, had a similar experience, and he did talk about it, and people were very sympathetic, but he hadn't been in Parliament, I think, at the time, so it wasn't quite as pressured. But there is an interesting issue hanging out there. Do you talk about your health issues, or do you try to get people just to treat you professionally and ignore it? Rachel, do you want to add?
Yes, it must have been hard for you.
Well, yes.
Doubly hard for you.
Well, it was certainly difficult because at the beginning, as you know, you're not allowed to drive for a while. And unfortunately, Vince decided this didn't include cycling. So we came to a deal where I said, well, okay, if you must, because West Middlesex Hospital isn't that far away, but I will always cycle behind you. But, I'm not quite as keen a cyclist as Vince. And apart from insisting on a helmet, which he was also extremely vague about at the time, it was just hard work. And then going to things where he was having to make speeches in public. I went with him for 6 weeks. And Alex Davis isn't here, but he was a tremendous support as well.
Sorry,
that's it.
Did you, were you influenced by the intensity of politics at the time in your decision to keep on?
Yes, because people, if you got something wrong, people were on your back immediately. In fact, there was one episode that quite a lot of people remember when I made a conference speech in the October of 2018, and I had what I thought was a brilliantly funny joke, which unfortunately my team sort of leaked out in advance, so I couldn't withdraw it. But it did involve one of these Peter Piper, Picked a Peck sort of stunts with your mouth, and it all came out wrong, and it came out as a good deal more vulgar than I'd intended it to be. And it was really, the following day, instead of the news bulletins being all about the future of liberal democracy, it was all about my scrambled joke. And so these things sound silly, but actually are important. And if you're in a high-profile position, they can be very damaging.
Clearly, to find out exactly what happened, you're going to have to buy the book. But Vince, were you worried about ageism? I kind of got that. I got a sense that as party leader, there was a sense, and Ming Campbell, of course, went through this very intensely. That sense he's past it. Did that bug you?
Yes, it wasn't a preoccupation, but there is in politics. I'm not saying this is a Lib Dem issue particularly, but there is in politics this attitude to age, which is kind of subliminal, I think. I mean, Ming was a great guy, as you all know, and a very good public performer. But he stood up I think when he was the first outing as party leader. He said, I now want to raise the issue of the appalling state of pensions. And some Labour backbencher, I think it was hard left guy anyway, sort of Dennis Skinner, that's right, intercepted him and said, have you declared your interest? And the place just, of course, fell about in laughter. And Ming didn't have an immediate response, and he was then branded, the old man who was past it. As it happens, I'm the same age as Ming, and I took over the party 10 years later, so I can't complain that the party was ageist, but it's very easy, I think, to jump on age. And of course, President Biden, who is, I think, almost my age or something like it, is trying to carry this, all the weight of being the most powerful man in the world, with people who are constantly hinting that he's got, early onset dementia or something. So it is something you're constantly having to battle against. But I say I'm not blaming the party for it.
No, of course it's not a party issue. But I was interested. I was curious to find out whether MPs are getting younger or whether it just looks like that. And it turns out that in fact the average age of MPs is very consistent from 1945. It's still 50 and a bit. Worked out at each election. But what is getting younger is party leaders and cabinets. I mean, Boris Johnson's cabinet was the youngest ever, and I wonder whether you think that that's having an impact on the conduct of politics.
Yes, Tony Blair had a very good comment at one point. He said, people become party leaders or prime ministers when they're full of energy but have absolutely no experience, and they leave office when they've got much less energy but they know how to do the job. And it's a kind of irony in the system, isn't it? And I think we have been through a bit of youth mania, which probably was misplaced. The Americans don't seem to have it, or the Chinese for that matter, but I think the cult of youth has been somewhat cut short by our rather mixed experience of it.
So, winding back now to the coalition, and the question I want to ask you from my heart is, why a coalition?
Well, those of you, there's a few familiar faces in the audience who were part of the agonizing process of agreeing this. And it is fair to say that when the choice was put to parliamentarians, both houses, and the activists of the party in 2010, there was very little dissent. I mean, there were people who spoke up and warned that this is going to be a catastrophe for the party, particularly in Scotland. Charles Kennedy, I think, was the most influential voice. Ming Campbell was another. But by and large, the party was united. Now, I think there were two reasons why the party went for coalition. People like me, who had no fondness for the Tories at all, went along with it. I would have preferred to have worked with Gordon Brown, but there were two reasons. One was political and one was economic. The political factor was that it was the only way that you could get a stable government. And if we'd stepped aside from it, and we did argue this through, it wasn't retrospective wisdom. We had all this scenario planning around these issues. Nick was very good at, he set up a group under Chris Huhn to think through all these possibilities. And we took the view that if we'd gone for the supply and confidence route that the Democratic Unionists took with Theresa May, what would have then happened was the Tories would have gone to the country after 4-6 months. Pretty much a repetition of the 1974 or the 64-66 experience. And they would have said, these bloody liberals are standing in the way of saving the country's economy, which is in a desperate strait, and we need to make tough decisions, and we've got these people hanging around our necks, doing nothing and blocking. So we want a massive majority, and all our analysis and polling told us that that's what would have happened. We wouldn't have been wiped out, but we would have suffered very severe damage, and we wouldn't have got anything, we wouldn't have achieved anything. All of that Clegmania and so on would have been for nothing. So that was one reason, it was politics, that we knew going into the coalition was a risk, but there was an upside, there was an opportunity. Right, the second reason was economic, and if people didn't understand this at the time, I think after the last 2 weeks they do now, is that during the period of coalition formation, I was approached by the head of the civil service, the permanent secretary to the Treasury, and various people speaking for the governor of the Bank of England saying, please, your party really has to step up to the plate and provide some stability because we're in potentially desperate straits here. Greece is already on fire. Britain has the biggest budget deficit in the developed world. If you do not signal very quickly that there is a clear plan to stabilize the public finances, sterling will crash, you will not be able to sell government bonds, the yields will go up. Now, does that all sound very familiar? But we were told that this would happen, and my judgment, and I think in retrospect, it is, I think, reasonable, said, well, we've just got to accept that. I mean, we didn't take the quasi-Kwarteng trust view, we can tell the markets to go to hell. We thought, well, we've got to, got to be responsible here. And so we bought into that agenda, and an awful lot followed from it, I'm afraid, which was not very palatable.
I'd like to come back to you on that, but Rachel, as a party activist, I mean, were you able to kind of think like a party activist, or were you so much at the heart of it that you had to see it from Vince's perspective?
Well, I think in the book I say that I have this image of the liberal Democrat Liberty Bird stuck in a conservative tree. If you remember, they'd just changed their logo, or of possibly a foie gras goose being stuffed with Trident. So my gut feelings were help. Goodness me, because I thought the overlap in policy was so small. But I accept everything Vince is saying and said then about the economy. Something had to be done. And I still think he was a very competent minister, much better than ones we have seen since.
I suppose the question that kind of is in my mind is, but Labour did have a plan. There was a plan. They would have done it.
Yes.
And they would have done it in a different and arguably better way than the.
No, actually, we followed the Downing plan. This is one of the great ironies. We've had, a decade or more of the Labour Party telling us about austerity being a terrible thing. But they had an austerity plan, which was the Darling plan, and that was to remove sorry to be technical, it was the structural, non-cyclical current deficit to zero over, I think, 6 or 7 years. And we started out aiming to do this over 4 to 5 years, but when we saw the pain that this was going to cause around about 2012, we backed off and slowed down the process. And in the latter part of the coalition, we were exactly following the Labour plan, or at least the Darling plan, by which time, of course, the Labour Party had moved on. But we were indeed following their plan. Now, there was an argument that we could have done more in terms of raising taxes than not cutting public expenditure. I think that was a serious issue. But when we did raise taxes at the beginning, value-added tax, if you remember, went up 5%. We did raise capital gains tax. There was such an outcry that, to be frank, cutting public expenditure seemed less painful than raising taxes. But however it was done, it was going to happen. And just one final point. Sorry, I'm rather hogging the answers here, but the one big area of dissent, which I was having privately with Osborne throughout the coalition, and my objection to austerity was not that we were cutting the budget deficit, we had no choice, but the Treasury defined it in a very, very narrow way. So what was happening is that the big hit was on public investment. All, you know, the railways, the telecommunications systems, science, things of that kind. And that was very damaging economically. And I went to George Osborne, I think, after, you know, we had a meeting about it. He said, I happen to agree with you. I think cutting public investment is a terrible thing to do, but I will only back off if you agree to deeper cuts in benefits. And we weren't willing to do it. So that was how the arguments about austerity went.
I was involved as leader writer on The Guardian at that time in the leader we wrote just ahead of the 2010 election, which Labour's never forgiven us for, because it said vote Liberal Democrat. And the reason for saying vote Liberal Democrat was that we thought that was the only way you'd get constitutional reform. Do you think it was a high enough priority in the negotiations?
No, in retrospect, it clearly wasn't. I think the negotiating team, which was Nick and I think three of my colleagues, Chris Hume, David Laws, Andrew Stummel, they got the Tories to agree to have this referendum on the alternative vote. Which they thought was actually quite a big prize, because the Tories have been opposed to any electoral reform on principle for obvious reason. In retrospect, it was nothing, because the Tories were obviously going to destroy it in the referendum, which what they did, and it wouldn't have been a very radical reform anyway. So I think that was our sort of collective failure of the party, actually, in not saying that, you know, this is number one, not number 7 in our list of negotiating priorities. And certainly, if there's a hung parliament in 18 months, 2 years' time, I think this probably has to be at the top of the list. Otherwise, we shouldn't go anywhere near it.
Yeah. How did you react to the? Were you surprised that it was AV rather than
the other forms of proportional representation? There was a time when I studied all this and knew the t'other from which.
You could chat about the ONT system.
I think by 2010 I'd lost the plot on all that. And we're still with that problem. I mean, Labour is saying now that it won't look at it. I don't see what we can do about it. And in my neck of rural Hampshire, when I talk to the women around me, oh no, they all think it's a terrible idea. They just don't get it at all. So I don't know what we do about it. So that's really,
yes, they sort of swallow the Tory propaganda that it's all going to make us like Belgium.
Yes, and I mean, the fact that we ended up with a hung parliament on the current system didn't seem to have sunk in. Yeah. And I dare say you would have more hung parliaments under a proportional system of some sort. But hey, quite a lot of Europe runs extremely efficiently like that. But that doesn't sway the good women of Southwest Hampshire.
I think generally you're probably talking to the converted in this one.
Yes, probably. Exactly.
The negotiations were such, Vince, that you ended up in the deeply difficult position of having a big Department of State, but the one that was going to have to implement the single policy on which which the Liberal Democrats had campaigned against so effectively and powerfully.
Well, I do try to explain, and I think probably a lot of people in the party never really understood, because it was never explained to them, the decision-making process which led to this awful outcome on tuition fees. I mean, in a way, I think the problem started a long time before we got into government. I think about 9 months before the general election, I'd gone to party conference and said, look, there's a disaster ahead. If we ever get into government, it's going to be all about cuts and increased taxes. It's going to be about austerity. And none of my colleagues, my colleagues were actually very angry. They said, you shouldn't be talking like that. You know, you go into an election offering things, you know, people want not tax cuts particularly, but they want spending commitments. That's what gets people elected. And, you know, indeed, that's how all parties tend to behave. I took the view that we should be offering blood, sweat and tears, but it wasn't the consensus. But then when the formation of the manifesto happened, there was a very strong mood in the party that we needed to have some good offerings, fees for students and other things. And then disastrously, the decision was made that we need to sign publicly this pledge to the National Union of Students. And it was that public pledge, I think, rather than the policy, which could have been finessed over time, it was that public pledge that really did for us. When we actually got into government, I was the Secretary of State, which was difficult because there had already been an agreement reached between Peter Mandelson, who was my predecessor, and the Tory opposite number was David Willetts, to increase fees substantially. They had got this man from BP, Lord Brown, to commission a report which basically said fees should find a market level, which was, I think, 15,000 maximum. And he published a report saying that this should happen, and the Labour Party, and of course immediately disowned it, but they had been party to this process, and the department was preparing for the implementation of this Brown report, letting fees reach a market level with various qualifications. I frankly struggle to get my head around all the technical complexities of university funding. I'd been doing the Treasury brief, not biz, but eventually it was very clear what disaster was potentially going to happen. I could see no alternative but to raise fees substantially, because the choice was this. Either you take the money from the teaching grant of universities, which was what led to fee increases, or else you take the money out of further education and you basically kill that sector, or you remove all student grants for maintenance. There were a series of options that were awful, and I probably made a mistake politically from the party's point of view in saying, well, I'm not going to go down that road. I mean, we have a responsibility for the low-income sector of the population who don't go to universities. The problem in the universities, and I think Vicky's here from Biz at the time, knows what was going on. The attitude of all the civil servants was, we've got to protect the universities, never mind the 50% the people who go to college. And so the attitude of the Treasury and my officials was, take all the money away from the colleges, nobody will notice, they won't riot, and make sure it goes to the universities. And in that way, you'll be able to keep down the fee increase. And I wasn't willing to go along with that. So I tried to package the agreement we had to make it as politically palatable as possible by making it like a graduate tax, which is basically what's happened. In fact, most students actually paid less than they did under the Labour system, but it was related to ability to pay. Nick Clegg got some extra money to put into issues around social mobility, which he genuinely cared passionately about. And we did a whole lot of other things to sugar the pill, but unfortunately, it was just lost in the noise. You know, we had betrayed the pledge, and it's still happening. I mean, I was on the radio yesterday criticizing the Truss government's incompetence. And say, you had your U-turn on tuition fees. Why are you criticizing this government for doing a U-turn on the 45p tax rate? I mean, it's hanging out there, part of the. It'll be there for the next 100 years, probably.
I guess though, since it's interesting to kind of think about lessons learned. Chris Huhn suggested that maybe cabinet making should be part of the negotiation, and that maybe that could have been finessed in the negotiations.
Yes, I think we should have thought a bit more carefully about the implications of who went where.
Yeah.
That was, I think, part of the problem. The formation of the government happened within hours. You know, within a few minutes of the coalition agreement being formed, Nick Clegg had to organise his team to be approved by Cameron. In fact, I won't mention names, but there were some rather important people who had just been forgotten about of my colleagues. I mean, they eventually got their way into government. They were just forgotten about in the rush. And I said to Nick, look, I'd like to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? He says, you must be joking. The Tories will never let you anywhere near it. So you're going to go to Biz. And I said, well, okay, but I can see a problem with tuition fees coming. So I said, why don't you give higher education to the Tories, Willits, and give me the banking system? Well, that was like a sort of nuclear explosion in the Treasury, and within 24 hours, the whole of the city had been mobilized to stop it. And so and Cameron was absolutely insistent that nobody they were not going to move the furniture, as he put it. And so I was confirmed in Biz. But we should have seen that this Exocet rocket was on the way. It was very clear from the outset what was going to happen.
I wonder what if there are any other key lessons learned. For example, what about the kind of maintenance of the coalition, which was originally about some kind of committee that would have had a representative number of both parties on it, but ended up being handled almost entirely by the Quad. Do you think that could be done better, or do you think inevitably it's going to end up with a concentrated but highly effective handful?
No, you had to have a dispute resolution system. I mean, I bellyache because I wasn't part of it, but that was just personal, really. No, I think Nick was quite right to say he needed to be there with, say, one or two other people to negotiate with the top Tories, Osborne particularly, because it was really a dual prime minister system. Basically, Cameron and Osborne were running the country, so it needed to have a Lib Dem equivalent to negotiate with them on all the kind of tricky issues that were coming up, departmental conflicts of one kind or another. So you needed a mechanism of that kind. You can argue about what they did and who it was, but I think every government, every coalition is going to need that.
But you wouldn't be saying to a successor, think harder about how that's done, or have some kind of separate or expanded backup system?
Yes, we should certainly need how to make that work better. But in government, things move so fast and are also so complex that you have no alternative to have a sort of core at the middle of government to unravel these issues.
Yeah. Rachel, you probably didn't sort of sign up for being a cabinet minister's wife, did you?
No, but I signed up for politics. I mean, I was under no illusion when I met Vince, and he was spokesman for the Liberal Democrats on trade or Treasury spokesman. Treasury spokesman. I mean, I was under no illusion that he was ambitious and able. So, no, I didn't expect to be in the cabinet any more than he did. But having got there, you did see it from a different perspective, I think is the word.
And I mean, I do love the bits in the book, maybe just because they resonate so much with my own life, where you, like, when the 2017 election happens, you think, oh, God, no, it's carving. How am I going to campaign in an election? I wonder how much, you know, trying to have your own life and your own busy and kind of long-term life.
Yes, well, from time to time, I tried to decide whether I could give up my rural life and simply live in Twickenham. And I can't quite do it. I mean, my heart was mainly in London, but my soul is in the countryside and always will be, I think. That's what makes me happy fundamentally. So yes, but yes, it was fascinating to be on the sidelines with no responsibility. That was a good thing. And whilst I'm unguarded sometimes in my comments, I did learn to be very careful. Some of my family's here, so they will confirm that. Yeah, so it was fascinating, obviously. And then there are the posh bits, the dressing up bits, you know, the banquets and so forth, and the Mansion House dinners. I mean, these are spectacularly glamorous events, which just at that level is quite fun.
I wonder, as the years of government and coalition wore on, which David Dawes rather memorably describes as, after a while, being like shut in a cage with a gorilla, whether you actually thought it was worth it. Did you, I mean, how seriously did you think you might step away?
Well, there was an argument going on in the party as to whether we should pull stumps, you know, a year before the end or 2 years before the end. It was fairly clear that Nick didn't wish to do that and wished to see the programme out and maybe renew it. I mean, that was, you know, there was an argument for doing that. There was another group in the party who were very voluble, including the president of the party, who was Tim at the time, Tim Farron, who thought we should keep the option open of walking away and fighting the 2015 election as a totally independent party with a separate agenda, which was as anti-Tory as it was anti-Labour. And we had that argument going on, and it sort of came to a climax after the Euro elections, and I described some of the rather awkward things that happened at that time. Some people may remember there was what was described as an attempted coup. I don't think it was quite that, but there was certainly quite a lot of unrest and a view that we needed to stop it. I had mixed feelings. I thought that there was an argument for keeping going and piling up you know, substantial legacy achievements. I mean, there were some ministers, you know, a good example would be Steve Webb, who was doing brilliant work with pension reforms, which took years to evolve and then put into legislation. And I was, certainly in the latter stages of Parliament, had begun to understand how the department actually works. I've never understood why ministers move after months. I mean, you know, it takes you 2 years to really understand what's going on. And by the end, I was beginning to, I think, do seriously useful things around the industrial strategy and the business bank and things of this kind. And I knew how to get them operating and make them work. So I was probably not as decisive as I should have been in throwing my weight behind the Tim Farrons, who said, look, this is enough is enough. We've got to make our own separate ways.
But isn't that the kind of core of the conflict in politics? It's what you were doing, and it's what the record shows, but it's not what people remember. And what really comes across from your book and from other reflections on the coalition is that the Liberal Democrats weren't very good at politics, and the Tories were completely ruthless.
Yes, I think that is right. They are absolutely. I think the worst thing they did before the 2015 election was during the referendum on alternative vote. I mean, it wasn't that they campaigned against us. I mean, they're perfectly entitled to, and there was never any understanding that they would support us. But the dirty tricks, for example, they were printing leaflets which had on them Labour quotations attacking Nick Clegg. This was quite outrageous. They had pushed for higher tuition fees than we eventually agreed to, but were attacking the Lib Dems over tuition fees. It was just utterly, utterly cynical. In fact, there was one dramatic cabinet meeting where Chris Huhne, who was still there, just got up and threw all the papers on the table, and there was this, it almost got to fisticuffs at one point. And Chris was actually, I think to his credit, genuinely outraged, and just couldn't take any more at that point. But the dirty tricks were the name of the game, and if you were working with Tory ministers, this made life difficult. But I think in my department, maybe I was just being naive, but we got good working relationships. I had Matt Hancock, who was sent to make trouble, but I said to him, look, leave your weapons at the door and we'll try and do something useful. And he got the point, and he became a very good minister, and he worked hard jointly with Joe Swinson, who was our junior minister at the time. And they did, we got some very good legislation. He built a reputation for competence, and as you know, he had other traits too, but it was possible to work with. I had quite a good relationship with George Osborne, but I mean, the guy was utterly ruthless at heart. We knew that. And then the climate.
Were you not ruthless? Sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I just think every tale suggests you weren't nearly ruthless enough. I mean, not least over tuition fees, where neither Osborne nor Letwin expected you, not you personally, but the Liberal Democrats, to accept what was on the table, or to make a deal about it at all.
Yes, I think probably we may not have been. I think the historical verdict is that we weren't nasty enough. And it came to a climax, really, in the 2015 election, if you remember, where the Tory campaign was just utterly relentless. If you're in a seat like mine, or those Lib Dem held seats, there was just a relentless pounding of day-to-day telephone calls from 10 Downing Street, personal letters from the Prime Minister saying, unless you vote, you may have a wonderful they actually said this, you may have a great local Lib Dem MP, but if this election is won by the Labour Party and the Scottish Nationalists, there will be chaos and, more or less bloodshed in the streets. And people panicked, and it was so cynical, and they tried this fear stuff very effectively with the Scottish referendum, and they thought it will work again, because it did. And they did it on Europe, and it didn't work.
Tell me in a sentence what you thought of David Cameron as Prime Minister.
Well, he was incredibly smooth, charming, extraordinarily charming, and a very good chairman of government, chairman of the cabinet. But when somebody makes the biggest political mistake in a century, you can't be kind about them, can you?
Did you see, Rachel, did you see election defeat coming in Twickenham?
No, not in Twickenham. Although Vince's agent, D2C, was way before that, 6 months before, very worried. And we worked very hard, but it was against the grain of this campaign, at which, was invented by the Australian Rottweiler, what's his name, and he just said, well, you get the SNP and Corbyn. And it was Miliband at the time. I'm sorry, it was Miliband.
Yeah.
But and this will be chaos. You can't afford to have some Lib Dems because it will dilute the number of Tories, and that's what we're up against. So I thought he would get returned in Twickenham, maybe rather a bit of a squeak. So no, I was amazed in one sense, but not completely surprised, I suppose, looking back.
And devastated?
Well, for me, the cloud had a silver lining, of course. I'll be honest. And then I discovered that, of course, I'd got what I wished for, more time with Vince. But I would actually need to carve out a little bit of time for the things I used to do, like painting and walking and all the things I do in the countryside.
And were you equally taken by surprise?
It was. I think I was deluding myself. Actually, I think, like most of our MPs, I think we went round the doorsteps and people were saying, you're doing a great job as an MP, and we voted for you before. And if the ears had been a bit more sharp, we would have heard the word "but." But that was the message all of us were getting, actually, in the Hell seats. We think you're great. We really like the coalition. It's a wonderful experience. We're very indebted to you. We think you've done a great job locally. But, and the but was the defeat.
And yet you came back again.
Yeah, well, that was partly hanging in there, I suppose, partly good luck. And I'm indebted, actually, to the London party. Actually, they threw the kitchen sink at Twickenham in 2017, and I didn't have to do very much. So I got a lot of help. But if it, I was, I
you
had
didn't, you didn't think, you kind of had your day.
No, I'd resigned to the fact that politics had finished, and we'd started a new life, and we were going on interesting holidays and doing all kind of new stuff. But I hadn't actually left as candidate. The strange way that we have in the party of having adopted candidates. And nobody had actually struck my name off the list. So when the election was called, I was still there. And I think what had happened was that Sarah Olney had won that by-election shortly before. So there was a sort of rush of energy in the party that we could actually turn this round if there was an election. We had brilliant election results in Twickenham. I think we'd won every seat on the council, something of that kind, and I was heavily involved. So that, when Theresa May made that terrible blunder, I was one of the MPs, Ed Davey was another, who was still in situ. But we mustn't forget that for a lot of MPs, it was an awful, awful experience. I mean, shortly after the election, Jo Swinson and her husband came to the farm, and they'd both lost their seats. And they were trying to build a life with a young baby, 2 people made unemployed, and it was, and a lot of, middle-aged MPs who hadn't done much else but politics. What do you do? And one of the things I've discovered through the Ex-Parliamentarians Association is the extent of mental illness amongst MPs who've been defeated. It's quite a big issue. A lot of them find it very difficult to come to terms with. And, for my colleagues, and I've tried to keep in touch with a lot of them, some of them have been really enterprising. Norman Baker runs a bus company and writes lots of articles, and there's a few others. Steve Webb's got a great job in the pension industry, and Paul Burstow's a professor at the South Bank University. But there's a lot of others who have really struggled to make their way.
And then, of course, you weren't just the MP again for Twickenham. You were party leader.
Yes, well, nobody else wanted to contest it. That's the ugly truth of the matter. But
what did you think? I mean, it was extraordinary times, and I just wonder where you wanted to put the party, where you thought you could be most effective at that point.
Well, I thought it was, and I think I was right. I mean, it was a long haul. There was no miraculous comeback because we had lost a lot of trust. I think not specifically on the tuition fees, but because all the left-leaning voters who voted Lib Dem to keep the Tories out, we had forfeited their trust, basically. And rebuilding that was going to be a long haul. And it had to happen primarily through local government. And I think one of the things I learned, I was aware of it anyway, but I really learned was the resilience and the, phenomenal talents of a lot of our local government people, the leaders in local government, the people running Portsmouth or previously Newcastle and Liverpool. They're fantastic guys, actually. And they was the people who were rebuilding the party at a grassroots level. And you just had to be patient and go through a cycle of elections where they could get back position, which is what they've been doing. And I think Ed has been very good at, that rebuilding, steady rebuilding process. And then superimposed on top of it, we had the Brexit campaign, and Tim Farron had put us in the position of being the anti-Brexit Remain party, which was very good, and we had members flooding in, I think tripled the membership. It did leave us with a dilemma, though, which I do write about in the book, is that by becoming the kind of hardline Remain party, the People's Vote party, we walked away from the soft Brexit option, which people like Norman Lamb were promoting. And in retrospect, I don't know whether you can replay history, but we might have been able to play a role working with people like Ken Clarke in, salvaging the customs union or something. But we were, by that point, a fundamentalist party, and I played my part. I think it was me who advocated adopting this slogan about, bollocks to Brexit. I was all for that. So I played my part in fundamentalism.
I mean, more secrets from the leader room, because after the 2017 result, I did think that surely the one thing that result proved, there was no majority for a hard Brexit, and that was the moment when actually a soft Brexit could perhaps have been achieved.
Yeah, but I don't think Lib Dems should be beating themselves up for not achieving that. I mean, what killed it really was Lancaster House. That was probably more important than the Brexit referendum. It was when Theresa May said, we are going to leave the European Union and we are going to leave the single market and the customs union. And she burnt the boats, really. I mean, it might have been possible when the Tories were on their uppers in 2018 to have retrieved some of that. But she was the person, she made, I think, a terrible strategic error by ruling out compromise options.
You did make an interesting point about the conduct of the campaign itself, which I've heard other people say, which was it was simply much too political. And the 75 campaign was quite carefully put businessmen and farmers and so on at the front of the campaign for staying in the common market. And I wonder if maybe, if we have another referendum, maybe that there are lessons to be learned about the way you make the case.
Yes, well, I was out of Parliament in 2016. The Lib Dems played virtually no role in it. Some of the warriors, Shirley Williams and so on, were out there campaigning. But essentially, the 2016 referendum, it was a Cameron-Osborne campaign. And they led it. There was a handful of Labour, people like Alan Johnson who got stuck in, but Corbyn sat on his hands, and most of the Labour Party. So it was led by Cameron Osborne trying to use the same playbook that they'd used in the Scottish referendum and the 2015 election. And they were the people who, they were just arrogant, complacent, and, what you suggest is, I'm sure, right, that a more considered, ecumenical approach would probably have produced a better result. But it was I think Corbyn and his people carry a very heavy weight of responsibility, actually. Yeah.
So on to maybe cheerier subjects, I mean, you weren't anticipating being a cabinet minister's spouse, and now you're the Liberal Democrat leader's partner, and I wonder whether that had any highs and maybe any lows?
Well, he became leader in 2017, and we'd just done extremely well in the May elections in 2018 when he had that very nasty episode with his health. And so it was very bittersweet because we really had done well in both the Euro elections and the local elections. Came back to London, tremendous applause. And then we went for this week to Italy, and he was already, in retrospect, not very well on that plane, but he was definitely seriously unwell by a day later. And we then, everything followed from that his leadership, which was getting somewhere, was then inhibited. I mean, his family were even more adamant than I was that he really didn't have to think about giving up the leadership. So that was tough.
Just a return before I throw the floor open, so I hope everyone's got their questions ready. I wonder how you see the political story of Brexit going from here, and you know, what the Liberal Democrats should be saying.
Well, I've just taken on the job of Vice President of the European movement because Michael Heseltine, who is the president, isn't very active, and they've asked me to do some of the heavy lifting for him. So I'm involved in that in a non-party way, and we're very clear that we have to work across parties. Any attempt to party politicize the rejoining Europe will backfire. It's very difficult because the Labour Party, Starmer, who was a very strong Remainer, have taken the view that they cannot continue with a policy of commitment to the European Union. They've said, you know, we're going to make Brexit work. Rachel Reeves has said that we could contemplate rejoining in 50 years' time, which of course infinity, more or less. So they have no interest in reviving this issue. Even joining the single market and the customs union, they have completely ruled out. So you've got no movement in the Labour Party, few dissidents, Stella Creasy and people like that, but not many, and they're more concerned now with getting back into government. The Tories, of course, the pro-Europeans have been wiped out, literally to a man and woman, I think. Yeah. So that leaves us and the Greens. And our party, I think for very understandable reasons, is not wanting to put its head on the block on this issue.
But can't you, isn't there scope for taking it, you know, brick by brick?
Yes, there is.
And to make the case for...
Yes, the party did have a report which I've read. I don't know how many people have read it, which is, I think Duncan may have been involved in it, which was a very carefully argued brick by brick approach to reopening these issues. It's a very sensible and entirely admirable route map to getting back into European institutions. But it's not a campaigning manual. It's not an issue that we're wanting to campaign on. Indeed, it doesn't feature in campaigning literature at all. And I was in Honiton at the by-election when the Tories produced this yellow scare leaflet. I don't know how many people saw it, but and I was on the doorsteps, and it was having an impact. It was a pretend Lib Dem leaflet saying the Liberal Democrats are going to rejoin the European Union, and all these Daily Mail readers who have said they will going to vote for Lib Dem this time because they're so fed up with Boris Johnson, started to panic. Oh, no, we can't vote for you lot if you're bringing that issue up again. So in parts of the country where we have to do well, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, and so on, this is still a toxic issue, and I think the party leadership is quite understandably nervous about it. I mean, I would like them to be more positive, but I'm not holding my breath that this is going to be a sort of Joe Grimmond return to, you know, fighting the European battle or Charles Kennedy. I think those days have gone.
Thank you both very much. I'm sure that everybody in the room has at least one question they'd like to ask. So Duncan is going to manage this.
I just need to interject with a short commercial for the Liberal Democrat History Group. Thank you, Anne, for that so far. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we were founded when this party was set up in 1988, and we promote research and discussion of every aspect of liberal history. And we do this in four main ways. One is through organising meetings such as this one. I can tell you that our next meeting will be on the 30th of January here in the National Liberal Club on Asquith's Lieutenants. So focusing on two fairly recent biographies of one of Edward Grey and one of Richard Haldane. And then the next one will be at the Liberal Democrat Spring Conference in March, and it'll be the other meeting that we were hoping to do at the Autumn Conference on the political career of Shirley Williams. So I hope you'll be able to make it one or both of those. Second thing we do is publish the Journal of the Liberal History. This is the latest issue, just hot off the press. It's a quarterly. We feature articles, book reviews, biographies, reports of meetings like this. If you're interested in picking up a copy, we are selling single copies down there afterwards, and also you can, of course, subscribe. And it costs, we've now moved to a new format of either print or digital subscriptions, and all the information is over there. We also publish a range of books and booklets, which hopefully, if you go to Federal Conference, you'll be able to see, but they're also available on our website. And the fourth thing is we maintain a website for students of liberal history, details of our activities, research resources, and so on, and that's at liberalhistory.org.uk. Thanks very much. Over to you, Anne, or over to questions.
Yes, over to questions. And Tony has now got the microphone, and to my left. So I'm going to just take one question at a time, because I think we get better answers.
Thank you. I make this point not to rake over the coals, but because it could become very relevant again if there's a hung parliament after the next election. If we accept, which I think I do, and Vince made strong points about this, that it was necessary to go into cabinet at the time and not have a conference and supply arrangement, did we not accept too much the conventions that go with that? In other words, cabinet responsibility, the whipping system, blah, blah, blah. Would it not be better to say, here is the coalition agreement, which we did do with policies set out, etc. Say, that is the agreement. That is what we are committed to. On anything else, our members will make up their own minds, and we will have our own whipping system. We will not simply say that there's some way in which we should agree to things which are not in that agreement.
Well, that would have produced sort of an unworkable government, because most issues are coming up on a day-by-day basis, some of which are very difficult. There are twice a year there is a financial statement, and they're normally very complex, and they involve a lot of bargaining to and fro on which taxes you want to support and how you get a bit more public spending on this. So having that thrown into the consultative process in the party is sort of an idealistic idea, but I have no idea how it would work. And we did have several budgets which became kind of public slanging matches, and everybody pitching in their pennyworth. And you remember George Osborne's catastrophe budget, when the taxes on caravans and pasties and so on. And we played a part on that by arguing the toss over every issue. But government decision making has to happen at speed, and it has to happen to some extent on a confidential basis, otherwise nothing ever happens. People are just sort of leaking stuff to undermine what's going to happen. So yeah, I think that more complicated mechanism would be very difficult to operate.
Does that make you think that maybe there shouldn't be another coalition?
Well, I think it's very unlikely the Lib Dems would now go into another coalition after our experience. but I'm not, you know, it's not my call anymore, but I would be, given the experience of operating a coalition under the first past the post system, as opposed to the German system, it's a bit of a fool's errand, I think. I think we've probably shut the door on it for the next few decades. And if there is another hung parliament, it probably will involve a looser supply and confidence type arrangement. But even those are problematic. I mean, you know, the DUP thought they were very clever in landing this deal, and somebody gave them £1 billion or something. But the Tories took them to the cleaners, you know. I mean, they completely sold out on this Northern Ireland protocol, and they've destroyed the DUP, you know, just as they did us almost.
Somebody on this side. The woman in the middle.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I've got a question for Rachel, actually. Is there anything that you ever really disagreed with Vince about, and did you feel able to kind of have those conversations? I mean, politically as well.
Yes, quite. Thank you. Thank you for that. Because I would disagree with him from time to time about the amount he took on. So that, which is not the same question. Because he was a glutton for punishment, exhausting himself, in my opinion. But on substantive issues, that's very difficult. I'm trying to think of a specific one. So, well, we have an old argument to do with free trade, which began when we first met in 2001, where I asked why he gave me a free trade lecture, and I asked why we had New Zealand butter from the furthest possible part of the globe without going back again. It is something we can produce here. There's no comparative advantage. Well, a bit, because they have grass all year, but not much. And so we continue to disagree about that. So I have my slightly nationalist shopping list.
I think we also disagreed about war, actually, as well.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yes, I'm a bit more of a peacenik. Yes.
So that became an issue with Libya and Syria.
Yes, Syria, the intervention in Syria. We were actually in France. Vince got on trains to come back and vote. And the curious thing was that my friend Anne, with whom I was staying, and I knew the outcome of the vote before he did, because he was on trains coming back again. But yes, so within the current situation, given Putin's approach to war, it's very hard to be a complete peacenik, isn't it?
It's a question. So at the back.
Can I pick up the coalition PR debate again? You have said very, I think, perceptively that there are difficulties about not going into coalition when what may follow is 2 years later or 6 months later a demand from the bigger party for a full mandate. How does that, which I think arguably one might lose, how then can we get PR?
Oh, well, there is potentially a road opening at the moment. As I understand the Labour Party conference, and although I was a member of the Labour Party 50 years ago, I don't fully understand its mechanisms today. They have now adopted a support for electoral reform without a referendum. That is the key, without a referendum. They have adopted that as policy. And that will be in the Labour Party manifesto, my understanding. I support these groups like Compass that are trying to work towards all this. Unfortunately, Starmer has sort of qualified it by saying, well, I agree with it, but it's a very low priority for the Labour Party. Maybe he had no choice but to say that, but it does dilute its significance. But I think the route would be, and it's quite a narrow passage, if the Labour Party win a larger number of seats than the Tories at the next election, that look as if they will, but not enough to have an overall majority. And in addition, they depend on the Lib Dems for support rather than the SNP. It's possible in those circumstances that they would agree with us to pursue electoral reform as part of some loose agreement. The problem is with the next election is the SNP, actually, because no English party wants to have anything to do with them. I mean, actually, they're probably decent human beings when you meet them, but politically, they're toxic. And so cross-party understandings on electoral reform which involve the SNP are very, very difficult to formalise, whereas you can imagine the Lib Dems and Labour working together. But that will depend very much on the arithmetic. You know, we will need to get well over 20 seats, I think, to be a credible number. And the SNP number will need to shrink. So it isn't, you know, how well Labour does. It's this rather intricate balance between the third and fourth parties that will determine whether we get the right kind of post-election agreement, including electoral reform. I mean, we know what to do. I mean, Jenkins did this very good report on AV+. We have a model, and people are not going to be sitting around arguing what PR means. It's very clear what it means. Some version of the German or the Scottish system. It's a question of just having the political coalition to make that happen.
Thank you. Question over here.
Thanks, Tony. I've got a question for Vince and Rachel. Just firstly, Vince, I did a postgraduate course at Maastricht, began it pre-Brexit, and the entire course was free. I think the government paid the university money for each student, and I was given €750 a party at the end of my course. But I just kind of wonder why we can't do a similar system in the UK. And just Rachel, I just wondered if you ever found the media attention intrusive when Vince was a minister. I remember passing your house, and there were press camped outside and so on. I'd wondered how you dealt with that.
I'm glad that's my question and not the first one, which...
To tell us about that, because
yes,
I was hoping to hear from you about that.
Yes, well, yes, it was difficult in Twickenham when you couldn't get out of the front door or the front gate, which isn't actually a gate as people locally know, it's simply a hole in the hedge. But I took a fairly, I think, laid-back view. You know, these were not cattle not wishing to go to market. These are journalists, and they're not going to touch me, which they didn't. But there was this quite funny episode where I came back from the countryside, went to Park, which happens to be around the corner, and found the two policemen on the gate. And they said to me, "Oh, we never knew this was where he lived." And I said, "Nor did anyone else until you were there." So from then on, we did have to at least bear it in mind. And there was just one occasion when it was near Christmas, that very cold day.
Murdoch stuff.
The Murdoch stuff. And there were these journalists, very junior ones, had been posted at 5, 6 in the morning on our gate. I first looked to them out of the bedroom window. And then there were more and more and more. And I implored them to go away and get warm. And one or two of them said, "Could you give us a cup of coffee?" And I said, "No, go away. There's a cafe opposite." But they were persistent. And it was genuinely physically difficult to get away in order to do the lunch we'd planned with Vince's constituency staff. I mean, it was genuinely dangerous, and the police were very kind and rang us beforehand and said, "When you need to leave, tell us," and we did, because...
What about your 5 a.m. encounter?
Oh, the 5 a.m. encounter. Yes, I was not there, but there was a day in June, I can't now remember which year, but Vince woke up to the sort of noises outside, and when he got out there in his dressing gown, there's a girl with bright blue hair who has put crime scene tape around our porch. And is very pleased with herself and is shouting things about being a crime scene. And it turned out she was an eco-warrior. However, I wasn't there, but he'd been to bed at 12:30 and he had meetings till late. He didn't need 5:30 a.m. And then I was reading the FT magazine months later, and there is our porch with the crime scene tape in the picture. And it was about an article entitled "Not Too Posh to Protest." And this girl, who turned out to be the granddaughter of a baronet, luckily I can't remember the name, and so the article was about her. And so I wrote to the editor and said, "Excuse me, but if you want a fashion shoot, you can pay us. And, you know, and could somebody find this girl a day job so that she isn't waking people who've worked rather hard all day, that hour in the morning?"
Vince, reciprocal scholarships for...
Yes, I mean, that was, in European terms, that was there was a program, wasn't there, which disappeared with Brexit, where we had student exchanges on attractive terms. No, I think, you know, the tuition fee issue is now sort of ebbed away, but the question of people getting good deals from universities is still a very live one. And universities have been quite creative. My grandson, or one of my grandsons, that is doing a degree at the LSE online. He doesn't go anywhere near, and they don't want him to go anywhere near, and he's been told it'd be preferable if he did his exams in Singapore and you know, did it all virtually. And they offer massive discounts now on the fees if you're willing to do it in these unconventional ways. And universities should have been onto this much earlier. You know, for example, there's absolutely no reason why you should have a 3-year degree. I mean, you know, you could do it in just over a year, cut out all the vacations, you know, operate on the places like Bolton University have started doing this. So quite apart from reciprocal arrangements, if universities were more creative, you could produce a lot of very high quality, cheap courses.
We must move along. Duncan, we should refer to some of our remote attendees.
Yes, we have 2 questions in the chat, one an extremely general one and one a very specific one. So taking the general one first from Tamara Galloway, with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you'd have done differently?
No, I think quite a lot of things. And if we're going back to the coalition days, I think I should have put my foot down at the very beginning and not gone into BIS as it was then constituted, with the full responsibility for higher education, which I had no preparation and didn't believe in what it was we were committed to doing. No, I should have put my foot down at that stage. And I think there were several points which Rachel will remind me of, where I had actually signed letters of resignation over issues of dispute within the coalition. And I think there's probably 1 or 2 of occasions when I probably should have gone through on it, actually.
Let's very quickly have the very specific question.
So the other one is from Norman Fraser. In retrospect, do you regret imposing charges on raising appeals against employment tribunal decisions? What was the rationale at the time?
Well, that was part of a package of labour market reforms, as they were called. The Tories came to me with a list of 19 changes to labour legislation, which would have effectively made strikes illegal, and we blocked all of them. But then they came back and said, you know, come on, you know, you're part of this coalition against growth. You know, that was an argument 12 years ago. You've got to do something to make it easier for employers to hire people. And there were various suggestions, most of which we stopped, like this Beecroft idea for so-called no-fault dismissals. But we did agree to review the system of charges for tribunals, subject to it only being for a year. And then it would be reviewed in terms of whether it had actually damaged people's ability to appeal against unfair decisions. And it clearly had a bad effect, right? But the minister who was responsible, which was the Department of Justice, then refused to honour the agreement we had made to stop it, and kept it. It was one of these ugly disputes within the coalition that was never resolved. But I certainly do regret the mess that it created.
Since thankfully strikes aren't illegal, I need to catch a train because there aren't any tomorrow. So can we take one more question? And then I'm sorry, I know there are a lot of people wanting to ask, but in the back there, I'm so sorry because I know you.
So I can't resist following up, Vince, on what one or two issues were you considering resigning that you wish you had?
Well, actually, that whole issue about public investments, because we'd got to a very difficult point in the coalition, at the end of 2012, I think it was, where growth hadn't appeared, where we were being criticised by the IMF. I mean, it was actually quite difficult to get the economy started because the banks were not lending. So there were good reasons why the economy wasn't growing. But we could have done more in terms of, just borrowing to invest, not just borrowing for its own sake, but borrowing to invest. And the Treasury, and I have to say, Lib Dems in the Treasury supported the orthodox view that, no, you can't. And I thought that was, doing a lot of harm, and I got very bad-tempered about it. I had a telephone call from Osborne at midnight saying, look, if you say what you're saying privately, this is going to the end of the coalition. And I was tempted to go in the following morning and say, okay, fine, well, let that be that. I don't think you talked me out of it, darling, but...
No, but I do remember in the midst of the Murdoch stuff, you asked your daughter and me whether you should go, and we were unanimous in saying no. And so everyone should be grateful that B Sky B was not acquired by Murdoch at that time.
So look, I'm very sorry to wrap it up now, but thank you very much. I've certainly found it extremely interesting, and I also very much enjoyed reading the book. So anyone who hasn't got it obviously will want to get a copy before they go home this evening. And just thank you all very much indeed for coming. And